No species invades human space, and the galaxy discovered the truth behind the terror. The Galactic Conclave had been around for a very long time, longer than most civilizations could remember. It was built on a simple idea, that the many species of the galaxy can sit together, talk together, and agree on rules that kept everyone from killing each other too often. It was not a perfect system. Wars still happened. Borders were still crossed. Planets were still burned from orbit when negotiations failed. But the Conclave existed, and that meant something. Every species that joined the Conclave had a history. The Velthari had conquered 12 systems before they signed the charter. The Doran had glassed 2 moons in a resource dispute. The Selkai had wiped out an entire subspecies they considered a nuisance. All of this was in the records. All of this was discussed, argued over, and eventually filed away. The galaxy was violent. No one pretended otherwise. But there was one rule that no one had written down. No one had voted on it. No one had debated it in the great circular chambers of the Conclave. It had simply existed, quietly, like a cold shadow at the back of every admiral's mind, every general's war table, every emperor's council room. No one invaded human space, not once, not in 400 years of humanity being a known spacefaring civilization. Not when the Velthari Empire was at the height of its power and hungry for new systems. Not when the Doran Collective needed new mining territories, and human space sat right at the edge of their expansion route. Not when smaller, newer civilizations looked at the maps and saw unclaimed stars and tried to calculate their odds. Something always stopped them. Rena had been a junior diplomat in the Velthari Foreign Office for 3 years before she noticed the pattern. She was young, still learning, still quiet in meetings where older officials talked loudly over each other. But she read everything. Every treaty, every report, every archived file she was allowed to access. And she noticed, slowly, the way certain files disappeared when you searched near certain dates. The way certain fleet records ended without explanation. The way certain admirals, famous for their boldness, had retired early and quietly after missions that were never properly documented. She started keeping a list. It grew faster than she expected. The Velthari had lost 3 full fleet groups near the human border in a span of 60 years, roughly 2 centuries ago. No battle reports, no distress signals, no wreckage ever recovered. The fleets had simply stopped transmitting somewhere in the outer range of human-monitored space, and then nothing. The Empire had listed them as lost to unknown causes and moved on. No one investigated. No one pressed for answers. The files were quietly sealed, and within a generation, even the families of the lost crews had stopped asking questions. Rena was not from one of those families. She had no personal reason to chase this. But she was curious, in the deep and stubborn way that certain people are, and she could not let go of the number 3. 3 fleets, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of crew members, gone without a single explanation. And the Empire had simply accepted it. She brought it up once, carefully, to her supervisor, a senior official named Boru, who had been in the Foreign Office for longer than Rena had been alive. He was calm, experienced, and very good at saying nothing in a great many words. But when Rena laid out her list on his desk and asked, quietly and professionally, whether there had ever been any follow-up investigation into the border incidents, Boru went still, not surprised, not dismissive, still. Then he looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was very even and very careful. "There are parts of the records that exist for good reasons," he said, "and there are parts that are sealed for better ones. I would encourage you, Rena, to focus on your current assignment." He picked up the list, folded it once, and placed it in his desk drawer. He did not give it back. The conversation ended there. But Rena remembered everything she had written. she was not the only one asking questions, though she didn't know it yet. On the other side of the Conclave's vast administrative network, in a research station orbiting a dim star at the edge of Selkai territory, a historian named Darrow had been quietly losing his mind over the same problem from a different angle. Darrow was not a diplomat. He was an academic, old enough to have permanent creases in his forehead from years of frowning at data screens. And he had spent the last decade trying to write a comprehensive history of every armed conflict near the human border. It was supposed to be a simple project, a cataloging exercise, something he could finish in a few years and hand to a junior archivist to format into a proper publication. It had not been simple. Every time he traced a conflict toward the human border, the records thinned. Data that should have existed simply didn't. Accounts that should have matched each other didn't. He found references to incidents that had no corresponding files. He found files that referenced events which had no corresponding incidents. The closer he looked at the human border in the historical record, the more it looked like someone had carefully, over a very long period of time, removed things. Not carelessly, not obviously. Just quietly and thoroughly, in the way that only institutions with a great deal of patience and a great deal of something to hide could manage. He filed 37 formal requests for access to sealed records over 5 years. Every single one came back denied, redirected, or simply blank. When he pushed through official channels, he was politely told that the records in question were under long-term review. When he pushed harder, he was told that his research funding was under review as well. He stopped pushing, but he did not stop thinking. Meanwhile, in the Conclave's main chamber on the station of Vela Prime, the gathered representatives of 43 civilizations were having a perfectly normal session about trade routes and resource rights. Human space was mentioned exactly once, in a footnote about a contested shipping lane, and when it was mentioned, 3 senior representatives physically shifted in their seats. No one acknowledged it. It was simply understood. You didn't expand toward human space. You didn't send fleets there. You didn't file territorial claims in that direction. You built your routes around it. You drew your maps with a quiet, invisible wall running along that border, and you did not ask questions about what was on the other side. And you especially did not ask questions about what had happened to the ones who had tried to find out. The galaxy was full of dangerous things. Ancient weapons left over from wars no one remembered. Dead stars that destabilized navigation systems. Predatory species that ate ships hull first. Every civilization learned to mark the dangerous places on their maps and steer around them. Human space was marked. It had no official designation, no warning buoys, no red zones in any formal conclave registry. But every navigator, every admiral, every cartographer knew the shape of it on a star map, and every single one of them drew their routes around it without needing to be told. Something lived there. Something that had made 3 Velthari fleets vanish without a word. Something that had never sent a declaration of war, never made a threat, never fired on a conclave vessel in recorded history, and yet had somehow convinced an entire galaxy without a single shot to leave it completely alone. Rena lay awake in her quarters that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Boru's face when she had shown him her list. Not afraid, not dismissive, careful, like a man who knew exactly what was on the other side of that border, and had decided a long time ago that he would rather not think about it. She pulled out a fresh datapad and started a new list. The decision to send a probe into human space was not made quickly. It was argued over for the better part of 2 years in closed sessions that were never officially recorded, by a small group of conclave scientists and administrators, who had quietly decided that the silence around the human border had gone on long enough. They were careful people. They did not talk about it openly. They filed the mission under a vague research category involving stellar cartography, which was technically accurate, since the probe would be mapping as it traveled. They kept the team small. 5 people who all understood, without needing to say it, that if this went wrong, there would be very little official support available to them. Hana was one of the 5. She was a xenobiologist by training, which made her an odd choice for a cartography mission, but she had spent years studying the limited data available on human biology and behavior, and she had convinced the mission lead that if the probe encountered anything biological, she would be the right person to analyze it. The mission lead had agreed, mostly because Hana was one of the few people who didn't flinch when the word human came up in a briefing. Most people flinched. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a micro-pause before the word left their mouth. Hana had catalogued it over years of professional observation. Fear, she had written in her private notes, that has been inherited rather than experienced. No one alive had seen a human fleet move in anger. No one alive had witnessed whatever had destroyed those Velthari ships. But the fear had passed down anyway, generation to generation, carried in the silence of sealed files and the careful way old officials changed the subject. Hana found that more interesting than the fear itself. The probe launched without ceremony on a quiet morning. It was a standard deep-range observation unit, reinforced, equipped with passive sensors and a long-range transmitter, designed to record everything it encountered and send the data back in compressed packets. It was not armed. It was not large. It was, by the standards of interstellar exploration equipment, completely unremarkable. They sent it into the outer edge of human space and waited. The first week was normal. The probe transmitted its cartography data on schedule, recording star positions, gravitational readings, background radiation levels. Standard stuff. Hana reviewed each packet with the rest of the team and found nothing unusual. She started to wonder if they had been overcautious. Then the transmission stopped. Not with a distress signal, not with a spike of interference that might indicate an attack. They simply stopped, cleanly, mid-packet, as if the probe had been switched off in the middle of a sentence. The team sat in their monitoring station and stared at the screens, and nobody said anything for a very long time. The mission lead finally spoke. "We wait," he said, which was all he could say, because there was nothing else to do. They waited for 11 days. On the 12th day, the probe came back. This was not supposed to be possible. The probe had no return drive. It had been designed as a one-way observation unit. It had neither the fuel nor the navigation programming to reverse course and come home. And yet, it drifted back into their sensor range on the 12th day, moving at a slow and steady pace, transmitting a low-power homing signal that led them straight to it. When they brought it aboard, the team stood in the recovery bay and looked at it in silence. The probe's casing was scorched in places, dark burn marks running along its upper surface in a pattern that didn't match any weapon signature in their database. 2 of its external sensor arrays had been removed, cleanly, with tools, not torn off or blasted away, and in their place, someone had welded 2 replacement arrays that were not conclave manufacture. Different metal, different design, but fully functional, as the probe's active systems quickly confirmed. Attached to the hull, welded on with the same unfamiliar metalwork, was a flat plate roughly the size of a hand. On it, etched neatly in 17 different languages, including, Hana noted with a cold feeling in her chest, 4 languages that were classified and should not have been known to anyone outside the Conclave's own translation archives, was a single sentence. "We saw you watching. Come say hello next time." The team stood there for a very long time. Then Hana got to work. She spent the next 3 weeks going over every piece of data the probe had managed to record before its transmission cut out. and what she found built a picture that was incomplete but deeply unsettling. The probe had entered a region of space that looked, at first pass, completely empty. No stations, no ships, no obvious infrastructure. Just stars and rocks and the usual debris of open space. But the passive sensors had picked up trace energy signatures that Hana could not explain away. Faint power readings, distributed across a huge area, in patterns that suggested something vast and spread out, and very deliberately quiet. Not like a weapon system, not like a military installation, more like the background hum of something industrial, something that was simply working and not particularly concerned about being noticed. And then there was the audio file, buried in a corrupted section of the probe's memory core, partially recovered by Hana's team after 4 days of painstaking data reconstruction, was a 12-second audio file recorded by the probe's ambient sound sensors. Space was functionally silent, but the probe's sensors were sensitive enough to pick up vibrations transmitted through contact. And at some point during the 11 days, something had physically touched the probe. The audio was rough, distorted, but it was unmistakably voices, 2 of them, close to the probe's hull, speaking a language that Hana did not recognize. And woven through the words, clear and bright even through the corrupted recording, was a sound she had not expected at all. Laughter. Not the short, sharp kind, not the polite, professional kind. Easy, relaxed, completely unguarded laughter. The kind that came from people who were doing something they found genuinely funny. As if the probe was a mildly amusing discovery. As if whoever had found it had pulled it out of space, looked it over, and said something to their companion that made both of them laugh before they got to work on fixing it. Hana listened to that 12-second file approximately 40 times. She sat with her headphones on in the quiet of her lab and listened to 2 humans laugh, and she tried to reconcile what she was hearing with the centuries of fear and silence and sealed files and vanished fleets. She could not. She brought her findings to the rest of the team. The mission lead listened to the audio file once, then sat very still for a moment, then said, "That's it. We're taking this to the full conclave committee." Fleet Admiral Kwan was the senior military representative on the conclave's border security committee, and he was not a man who was easily rattled. He had served in 3 active conflicts, overseen 2 major fleet deployments, and spent the last 15 years managing the kind of slow-burn political crises that wore lesser officials down to nothing. He was calm by nature, and professional by long habit. He listened to Hana's full report. He reviewed the probe data. He looked at photographs of the welded repair work on the hull. He read the translation of the plate. "We saw you watching. Come say hello next time." Twice. Then he leaned forward in his chair and looked at the room of tense, quiet officials around him, and asked the question that everyone had been circling for the past hour without saying out loud. "Are they," he said slowly, "inviting us?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Nobody in that room had expected this. They had expected a destroyed probe, or no probe at all, or at best a partial data return with some ambiguous readings. They had not expected their probe to come home repaired, with a note attached, and the sound of laughter in its memory. The fear that had lived quietly in the back of every official's mind for generations was still there. But next to it now was something new and considerably more complicated. Curiosity. Hana walked back to her lab that evening and pulled up everything she had ever written about humans. All her years of research, compiled from the scraps and fragments that the Conclave's sealed records had let through, pieced together from alien accounts and second-hand descriptions, and the very occasional intercepted signal. She had always suspected that the picture she was building was incomplete. She was beginning to understand just how incomplete it really was. Outside, in the cold dark between stars, human space waited, quiet as it had always been, patient as it had always been, as if it had been waiting, all along, for someone to finally come and say hello. No species invades human space, and the galaxy discovered the truth behind the terror. The debate over whether to actually send a delegation into human space lasted 4 months, and nearly broke the committee 3 separate times. There were those who thought it was the worst idea anyone had ever presented in the history of the conclave, and they were willing to say so at length and with considerable volume. The probe coming back was not reassurance, they argued. It was a demonstration. Whatever lived in human space had detected their little observation unit, neutralized it, and sent it home with a message. That was not the behavior of something friendly. That was the behavior of something that wanted you to know, clearly and without any ambiguity, that it had seen you, that it had chosen to let you leave, and that the choice had been entirely theirs. Quan heard all of this and understood it. He also pointed out, in the flat and even voice he used when he wanted people to stop yelling, that the probe had been repaired, that the crew of whatever craft had intercepted it had fixed 2 of its damaged sensor arrays with functional replacements, that the message on the hull had been written in 17 languages, including 4 that no outside civilization should have been able to access, which meant that whoever wrote it had done so with the specific intention of being understood, and that the message itself, read plainly, was not a warning. It was an invitation. The debate went on. Rena, who had been pulled into the committee after her research files had been quietly flagged by an administrator who recognized their value, argued for the delegation with everything she had. She was younger than most people in the room and knew it, but she had spent months building the most complete picture of the human border situation that anyone in the conclave had assembled, and she knew the data better than anyone. She laid it out clearly, calmly, and without exaggeration. No confirmed hostile engagement in 400 years. Fleets gone, yes. No bodies, no wreckage, no demands, no declarations, no territorial expansion, no communication, just a border that sat exactly where it had always been, and beyond it, silence. Not the silence of something sleeping, the silence of something that had decided it simply wasn't interested. "We've been afraid of a wall," Rena said at one point, in a committee session that went very quiet after she said it. "We built the wall ourselves. We painted it with everything we feared and called it a monster. And now, the wall has sent us a note asking us to visit, and we're still standing here arguing about whether to knock." Darrow, who had finally been brought in as the historical consultant after 15 years of having his archive requests ignored, said nothing during most of these meetings. He sat in the corner with his data pads and his long creased forehead, and his expression of a man who had been waiting a very long time for everyone else to catch up. When they finally asked his opinion, he said simply, "Send the delegation. Whatever is over there, it already knows we exist, and it's decided we're not worth destroying. I'd like to understand why before I die." The vote passed, barely. They kept the delegation small. 4 people, 1 ship, no weapon systems that weren't purely defensive, no military escort. Quan went, because no one was going to send a diplomatic mission into the unknown without someone who could make hard decisions quickly. Rena went because she knew the research. Hana went because she was the closest thing they had to a human expert. Darrow went because he had earned it. The journey through the border was unremarkable, which was itself remarkable. No interdiction signals, no demands for identification, no warning shots. They crossed into human space on a quiet morning and kept going, and nothing happened. The stars looked the same. Space was still cold and dark. Their instruments recorded normal readings. Quan kept his eyes on the tactical display for the first 6 hours without blinking very much. On the 8th hour, a signal reached them. Not aggressive, not coded. A simple, clear transmission on an open frequency in the conclave's own standard language, spoken in an accent that none of them had heard before, but that was completely intelligible. Hey, the delegation, right? Keep your heading. We'll meet you at the marker. Bring your own cups if you want. We've got plenty, but ours are kind of beat up. Hana wrote, "Bring your own cups" in her research notes and stared at it for a moment. They reached the marker, a simple beacon, nothing threatening, the kind of navigation buoy used across dozens of systems, and found a single human shuttle waiting for them. It was small, older-looking, the kind of craft that had been repaired many times, and showed it, with patches on the hull and a slightly uneven thruster output that showed up on their sensors. It drifted comfortably alongside their vessel, and a short-range communication channel opened. The two humans on the screen looked, to the delegation, startlingly ordinary. The man was of average build, somewhere in middle age, with tired eyes and an easy manner. He introduced himself as Tay. He was wearing a work jacket that had the name of what appeared to be an engineering company on the chest, and he was holding a thermos in one hand. He reached forward immediately and shook hands with everyone, which required him to grip the camera pickup and lean toward the screen in a way that was clearly a joke he'd made before and still found funny. His handshake, translated through the screen, was too firm. The woman was younger, sharper-eyed, with the specific kind of energy that came from someone who was always thinking about three things at once. Her name was Yule. She started talking almost immediately, and used more words per minute than anyone on the delegation was accustomed to dealing with in a first meeting. She was enthusiastic in a way that seemed completely genuine and slightly disorienting. She laughed at things that didn't appear to be jokes. Quan, who had prepared for this encounter with the same focused professionalism he had brought to every high-stakes situation in his career, opened his mouth to deliver the official greeting he had spent 2 weeks rehearsing. Tay said, "Don't worry about the formal stuff. We can do the official version once we're docked. You want to follow us in? Station's about 40 minutes out." Yule made food. Quan closed his mouth, looked at Rena, looked at Hana, looked at Daro, who shrugged with the expression of a man who had expected something like this. "We'll follow you," Quan said. The station was not what any of them had imagined. They had prepared, in their private minds, for something vast and cold. A fortress, banks of weapons arrays, military architecture designed to project dominance and absorb punishment. The kind of thing that matched the legend. What they docked at was a working station. Mid-size, clearly old, expanded multiple times over many years in ways that weren't always perfectly uniform, which gave it an organic, irregular shape that no military architect would have approved. It was busy. Docking traffic moved in and out with efficient, practiced ease. Their vessel was waved through by a port controller who sounded faintly bored, as if diplomatic delegations from the edge of known space were a normal Tuesday. Inside, the corridors were warm. That was the first thing all four of them noticed, and later independently recorded in their respective notes. After the controlled chill of their own vessel, the station air was warm and carried smells. Food, something mechanical, something that might have been plant life, something synthetic and faintly sweet. The lighting was softer than Conclave standard. The walls had things on them. Notices, schedules, a few hand-drawn images that appeared to have been made by children, a faded sign in a language none of them could read, with what appeared to be a cartoon figure on it. A group of actual children ran past them in the corridor, running, loudly. One of them nearly hit Daro, veered away at the last second, shouted something that was probably an apology at speed, and kept going. An adult voice somewhere behind them called out something sharp, and the children's volume decreased slightly, but did not stop. Somewhere further down the corridor, someone was playing music badly. They were playing it with a lot of enthusiasm, but not a lot of precision, and it was clearly bothering at least one of their neighbors, because a voice was raised periodically in objection, which the musician ignored. An elderly woman in a corridor intersection was having an argument with a wall-mounted service machine. She was losing on technical points, but she was not accepting this. Quan looked at all of this, and looked at Tay, who was walking beside him with the easy comfort of someone in a place they'd been 1,000 times, and said the only thing he could think of. "Where are your weapons?" Tay smiled. It was a simple, relaxed smile. The kind of smile someone gave when they'd been asked a question they found mildly amusing. "Oh," he said, "they're around." He didn't explain further. He topped up his thermos from a machine on the wall and kept walking. And for reasons that Quan could not immediately articulate, that answer was somehow more unsettling than anything else he had encountered since crossing the border. Because Tay wasn't being evasive. He wasn't trying to intimidate. He was completely calm, completely honest, and completely unbothered. And the fact that a man who spoke about weapons the way other people spoke about office supplies in this warm, cluttered, music-playing, children-running station was the single most disorienting thing Quan had ever experienced in a career full of difficult situations. Rena walked at the back of the group and looked at everything. She had spent years building a picture of this place in her mind. She had been afraid of it and fascinated by it in equal measure, and she had crossed the border not knowing which feeling would win. Standing in this warm, loud, messy corridor, she felt the fear quietly set itself down and walk away. The fascination stayed. It got considerably larger. She pulled out her datapad and started writing. No species invades human space, and the galaxy discovered the truth behind the terror. They were given quarters on the station. Clean, simple rooms with beds, and a small common area where Yule had left a pot of something hot and dark on a side table, with a handwritten note that said, "Don't let it go cold, it gets weird." Hana stared at the note for a moment, then poured herself a cup, and decided that whatever was in it was the strangest thing she had ever tasted, and she wanted more of it immediately. The formal session began the next morning in a meeting room that had clearly been tidied recently and specifically. There was a visible line of clean floor where a stack of something had been hurriedly moved, and one of the chairs didn't match the others, but was otherwise comfortable and practical. Tay and Yule were there, along with two other humans who were introduced briefly. One was an older man named Bak, who had the look of someone who had spent a long time doing physical work in space and had opinions about everything. The other was a younger woman named Sue, who spoke less than the others, but listened in the focused way of someone who was going to remember everything. There was no ceremony, no formal opening. Tay sat down, refilled his thermos, and said, "So, you want to know about the fleets?" It was not a question. Quan, who had prepared a careful opening statement, set it aside. "Yes," he said, "we want to know about the fleets." Tay nodded. "Okay, which ones do you want to start with?" There was a brief pause while the delegation absorbed the implication of that phrasing. Which ones, plural, as if there were enough of them that you needed to choose a starting point. Darrow opened his archive files. The Velfari, 212 years ago. Total of approximately 300 vessels. Bach made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been agreement. The Kalen incident. Yeah, that one was a mess, honestly. Darrow looked up from his screen. The Kalen incident, he repeated carefully. That's what we called it internally. After the region. You want the full version or the short version? Full, said Darrow, Rena, and Hana simultaneously. Quan said nothing but made a gesture that clearly meant the same thing. Bach leaned back in his chair, with the ease of someone settling in for a story they'd told before. Maybe not to this audience, but enough times that they knew the shape of it well. 212 years ago, a region of outer human space called the Kalen Belt had been undergoing active mining operations. It was a dense debris field, asteroid clusters, dormant comet fragments, chunks of what had probably been a planet several million years ago, rich in the kind of heavy elements that made mining operations profitable. The humans had been working it for about 40 years at that point, with a rotating population of mining crews processing stations, and automated systems spread across a wide area. The automated systems were the important part. Mining debris fields was dangerous work. The automated defense systems around human mining operations were not designed to shoot down enemy combatants. They were designed to protect workers from debris impacts, from sudden gas venting, from equipment malfunctions, and from the occasional collision between unmanned craft and the people trying to do their jobs nearby. They were, in other words, very good at detecting large metallic objects moving at speed through the belt and stopping them before they could hit anything important. 300 Velthari warships were very large metallic objects moving at speed. The automated systems did what they were built to do. They detected. They classified unknowns moving with purpose, heading toward populated work zones, and they responded. Not with weapons, with interdiction fields and tow protocols. The same systems used to catch runaway equipment caught an entire fleet instead. The ships were disabled, their drives cut, and they were held in place until human response crews arrived. What the response crews found was a fleet of warships full of very confused Velthari sailors who had no idea what had just happened to them. Bach paused here and glanced around at the delegation's faces. "Nobody was hurt," he said. "Our people made sure of that. When the crews realized the ships were being boarded, there were some incidents. Your people didn't know what was going on. We get that. But our response teams are trained for that kind of situation. We got everybody calmed down, got the medical teams through, checked for injuries. Couple of broken bones on both sides. Nothing worse." Rena stared at him. "You boarded 300 warships." "We towed 300 warships," Bat corrected. "We boarded them after. Needed to check on the crews. Standard procedure." Quan spoke very carefully. "What happened then?" Tay took it from there. The crews had been transferred to the nearest processing station, which had not been built for guests on that scale, and had consequently been very crowded for several weeks while the humans figured out the logistics. They had been fed, they had been given medical care. Translators had been brought in. The Velthari admiral in charge had been, by Tay's description, pretty upset, which is fair. We just towed his whole fleet. And there had been a series of tense conversations that eventually settled into something functional. The humans had explained, clearly and in detail, that the Velthari fleet had entered an active industrial zone without any communication, any warning, or any identification, and that the automated systems had responded accordingly. They had offered to return the fleet. They had submitted a formal incident report for the diplomatic channels that existed at the time. They had also submitted an invoice for the emergency response costs, the towing operation, the medical treatment, the temporary housing, and the fuel used by the response crews. Darrow put his datapad down very slowly. "An invoice." "Standard procedure," Tay said again, without any irony at all. "That operation cost us. We don't have unlimited resources. Response crews, fuel, time on the processing station, all of that costs something." The invoice was reasonable and itemized. "The Velthari Empire never paid it," Rena said, recalling the records she'd rebuilt from fragments. Tay shrugged. "No, they didn't. We filed it 3 times over 10 years and then wrote it off. More trouble than it was worth to chase." He paused. "We still have it on file, technically, if anyone wants to settle up." The room was very quiet. Hana broke it. "The fleet was never reported as recovered," she said. "The Empire listed them as lost to unknown causes. There were never any survivors mentioned in the official record." Yule, who had been quiet for most of the morning, made an expression that was halfway between amused and genuinely irritated. "Yeah, that part annoyed us, honestly. We sent those people home in their own ships. We fixed the ships that needed fixing. We gave everybody their gear back. We were very clear in the incident report about what had happened." She paused. "Apparently, the Admiral reported it as a navigational disaster, with no survivors. There was a long silence. He was embarrassed, Rena said quietly, understanding it as she said it. The shape of the whole thing was becoming clear. An admiral whose fleet had been towed by mining equipment, who had been housed in a crowded industrial station and fed by workers and sent home with an unpaid invoice, who had gone back to an empire that expected victory or glory and had neither. He couldn't report the truth. No, Yule agreed, he couldn't. She didn't sound angry about it. She sounded tired. So the truth got buried, and then the next incident got buried the same way, and the one after that. Each time, the same thing. Our systems catch something that comes in without warning. We deal with it. We send people home. We file the report. The other side quietly makes it disappear because the truth is embarrassing. She took a drink from her cup, and the silence builds up, and the silence becomes fear, and the fear becomes legend, and 20 generations later, the whole galaxy is terrified of us, and we're sitting here in a mining station, wondering why nobody ever just knocked. Darrow was writing as fast as he could. His forehead creases had gone very deep. Every incident, Quan said. It was not quite a question. Every one we know of, Tay confirmed. We've got our own records. Pretty complete, actually. We kept them because the invoice system required documentation. He looked at Darrow. You want copies? Darrow looked at Tay with the expression of a man who had been trying to access these records for 15 years through official channels, getting blanked at every turn, and was now being offered them over a cup of something hot in a mismatched chair. Yes, he said. I very much want copies. Bat got up and went to a terminal on the wall. He pulled up files and started transferring them. Just like that. No security review, no access committee, no formal request process. Just a man transferring historical records to a historian, because that was what made sense. Hannah had been very quiet for the last part of the conversation. She was reviewing something on her own datapad, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but had something underneath it that was very close to wonder. You've been here for 400 years, she said. You've been watching the border. You've had other civilizations cross into your space, and you've dealt with it, and you've sent people home, and filed reports, and submitted invoices, and not once in 400 years did you ever fire on anyone. You never issued a threat. You never made a declaration. You never said, stay away, or this is what happens to those who cross us. You just... She stopped. We just lived here, Tay said simply. We had work to do. He said it without drama, without pride, without any awareness, it seemed, of how extraordinary it was. As if 400 years of unintentionally terrifying an entire galaxy while just trying to mine asteroids and keep the lights on was simply a thing that had happened, and not a thing that required a grand statement. Rena looked out the small window in the meeting room wall. Outside, a cargo loader was moving a container across the docking bay. 2 workers in heavy suits were arguing over a manifest, gesturing at a screen. A 3rd worker was sitting on a crate, eating something, and watching the argument with the expression of someone who had seen this argument before and knew how it ended. The most feared space in the galaxy. 400 years of silence and legend and sealed files and inherited dread. Full of people doing their jobs. She looked back at the table, at Tay and Yule and Bach and Sue. At Quan, who was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table, processing something that his entire military career had not prepared him for. At Darrow, who was writing so fast he was going to run out of space. At Hannah, who was looking at the humans the way she looked at a research subject that had just invalidated 5 years of prior assumptions and opened 10 new directions of inquiry simultaneously. You said the invoice is still on file, Rena said. Tay nodded. For the Velthari fleet, 212 years ago. And every other incident. Yeah, we're very organized about that kind of thing. Rena thought about Boru, her old supervisor, and his careful face, and his folded list, and his drawer. She thought about 37 rejected archive requests, and the way entire civilizations had built their navigation routes around a border they didn't understand. She thought about the probe coming home repaired, with a note in 17 languages, and the sound of laughter in its memory. "I think," she said slowly, "that the Velthari owe you a very large amount of money." Yule smiled for the first time since the meeting began. It was a very good smile. "We're flexible on payment plans. No species invades human space, and the galaxy discovered the truth behind the terror." The delegation stayed for 3 days. They had planned for one. There was simply too much. Too many files that Darrow needed to go through. Too many questions that Hana needed to ask. Too many things that didn't match the picture the galaxy had built of this place. And every single discrepancy led to another question, which led to another conversation, which led to another evening, sitting around the common table in the quarters Tay and Yule had arranged for them, with cups of that hot dark drink, and people talking well past the point when anyone had intended to still be awake. On the second night, Hana asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the moment she had listened to that audio file from the probe. The easy, unguarded laughter of two people who had found a conclave observation probe in their space and thought it was funny. "Weren't you afraid?" she asked. "Of us, I mean. Of the rest of the galaxy. You knew we were out there. You knew we were watching. You knew we were afraid of you." Yule thought about this for a moment. She was the kind of person who thought before she spoke, Hana had come to realize, even though she spoke quickly once she started. She gave the question real consideration. "Afraid isn't quite the right word," she said finally. "Cautious, maybe, for a long time. When we first started expanding and realized there were other civilizations out there, there was a lot of debate about how to approach it, whether to reach out first, whether to wait, whether to establish ourselves more fully before making contact." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "And then, the first couple of incursions happened, and we dealt with them, and the other side went quiet, and we thought, okay, that went fine. We'll wait for them to reach out when they're ready. We waited 400 years, Rena said. You weren't ready, Yule said, without any criticism in it, just a statement. Tay added from across the table, "We had a lot going on. It's not like we were sitting here staring at the border. We had work, we had problems to solve, we had our own politics, which are honestly exhausting enough without adding interstellar diplomacy on top of it." He refilled his thermos for what Quan privately calculated was the 8th time that evening. "We figured when somebody wanted to talk, they'd find a way. And here you are." Quan, who had been quiet for most of the evening conversations, spoke up. "You said your defensive systems are automated, designed to protect workers." He chose his words carefully. "Those systems are also capable of disabling and towing warships. Was that intentional when you built them?" There was a brief pause around the table. Bach, who had joined them again for the evening, made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time. "No," he said. "Honestly, no. We built them for the debris fields. Rocks don't care whether you classify them as a threat before they hit you, so the systems don't classify before they respond. They just respond. Anything large moving fast toward a work zone gets caught." He shrugged. "The fact that it works on warships is kind of a coincidence." "Kind of," Sue said, speaking for nearly the first time all evening. She said it in a very quiet, very flat voice, and then looked at her cup. There was a small silence. "Mostly a coincidence," Bach said. Darrow, who had been listening with the expression of a man cataloging everything for future publications, said, "Your defensive systems stop everything equally. Asteroids and warships and debris and whatever else comes through, with the same response, with no requirement for a threat assessment first." He paused. "There is no way for anything entering your space to know whether it will be stopped or not. Because the systems don't decide. They simply act." "Yeah," Tay said, "and therefore, Darrow continued, slowly. There is also no way for anything entering your space to calculate an approach that would work, because there is no decision to predict. There is no gap in the logic. There is no moment where the system asks, is this a threat? It simply catches everything, because that is what it was built to do. Another pause. You built the perfect defense, Darrow said, by building something that was never intended to be a defense at all. Tay looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at his thermos. Then he said, I mean, when you say it like that. Hana was writing very fast. The third day was quieter. They went through documentation. Darrow received approximately 600 years of incident records, filed chronologically, with full operational detail, multiple cross-references, and attached invoices in varying states of completion. He sat with his data pads in a corner of the meeting room for most of the day, and made sounds at intervals that suggested he was experiencing something close to academic joy, which was the most intense emotion Darrow was generally known to experience. Rena spent the day in conversation with Yule, going through the diplomatic history, or rather the lack of it, from the human perspective. What she got was a picture of a civilization that had tried, at various points, to open formal channels, had found the attempts either ignored or quietly buried, and had eventually decided that the galaxy would come to them when it was ready. There was no resentment in the way Yule described it. Just a long, practical patience that Rena found almost difficult to process, because patience of that kind was not something the Conclave's political culture had much experience with. Hana spent the day with Bach and one of the station's engineers, a quiet older man named Rock, who walked her through the automated defense systems in more technical detail than she had ever expected to receive. What she understood by the end of it was that Darrow had been exactly right. The systems were magnificent in their simplicity. They didn't think, they didn't assess, they acted. And because they acted on everything equally, there was no strategy that could circumvent them, no approach angle that offered an advantage, no timing that created a window. The defense of human space was, from a military standpoint, theoretically perfect. And it had been built by mining engineers trying to stop their workers from getting hit by rocks. Quan spent his day walking the station. He walked slowly, which was not his usual pace, and he looked at everything. He watched the cargo operations. He sat in the station's main common area for an hour and watched the ordinary business of the place. People eating, people arguing, people telling each other things they found funny. A group of children doing something complicated and competitive with colored markers on a piece of wall that appeared to have been designated for exactly this purpose. He watched a repair crew work on a section of damaged corridor with the focused efficiency of people who had done this specific job many times and knew it well. He watched a medical team move through on rounds, stopping to check on workers who were off shift and recovering from minor injuries, talking to them the way people talked to people they knew and cared about. He thought about 300 warships being towed by mining equipment, and their crews being fed and sent home with an invoice. He thought about 400 years of silence and the legend that had grown in it. He thought about the galaxy navigating around a border they didn't understand, building their fear into something vast and cold and monstrous. And the reality on the other side being this: warm corridors, and children's drawings on walls, and someone playing music badly in a residential block. He found Tay, near the end of the day, in the docking bay, checking something on a cargo manifest. Tay looked up when Quan approached, and waited in the easy way he had, relaxed without being disrespectful. Quan stood next to him, and looked out at the docking bay for a moment. "You're gonna have a lot of visitors," he said, "once this report goes to the Conclave. You understand that?" Tay nodded. "Yeah, we figured. Honestly, we've been thinking about it since the probe. Once you sent that, we knew something was going to change." He looked out at the bay with the expression of a man who had thought about this a lot and made his peace with it. "It's fine. It was always going to happen eventually. We just needed somebody to knock first. You could have knocked, Quan said. Tay was quiet for a moment. We tried, a few times, early on. The messages didn't really land. He shrugged one shoulder. And then the border incidents happened, and they went the way they went, and the silence got bigger. And it didn't feel like our silence anymore. It felt like, I don't know, like the galaxy needed some time, some space. He almost smiled at his own phrasing. We had work to do. We waited. Quan looked at him, a man in a work jacket with a thermos, standing in a docking bay, representing 400 years of the galaxy's greatest unasked question. 400 years is a long time to wait, Quan said. Yeah, Tay agreed, but here you are. The delegation left the next morning, their vessels loaded with more historical data than Darrow could read in a year, with Hana's notes running to several hundred pages and still growing, with Rena's mind already working through the diplomatic architecture that the next phase would require, and with Quan carrying something that he did not have a precise professional word for, but that felt, after years of managing threats and calculating risks, surprisingly like relief. The report they delivered to the full conclave was not quiet. Nothing about its release was quiet. Darrow published his findings through the open academic records simultaneously, which meant that 43 civilizations received, at approximately the same time, the most complete account ever assembled of what had actually happened at the human border over 4 centuries. The incident records, the towing operations, the medical treatment, the invoices received, it must be said, a disproportionate amount of attention. There was something about the idea of 300 warships being towed and then billed for the experience that the galaxy found very difficult to move past. The Velthari Empire's official response took 2 weeks to draft and was, when it finally arrived, remarkable primarily for what it did not say. It did not say that the records were inaccurate. It did not say that the incident had been misrepresented. It said, in careful diplomatic language, that the Empire acknowledged the historical record and looked forward to establishing formal dialogue with humanity on the basis of mutual understanding. It did not mention the invoice. Several other governments quietly reached out to ask, through unofficial channels, whether the invoices for their own respective incidents were still outstanding. The answers, uniformly, were yes. Humanity's record-keeping was very good. Rena submitted the full diplomatic framework for opening formal relations. It was approved faster than anything in the conclave's history. Hana published her research. It reshaped the field of xenobiology in ways that were still being unpacked 3 years later, beginning with its central argument, which was that the most feared civilization in the known galaxy had not built their reputation through aggression, but through the complete and total failure of every other civilization to be honest about what had actually happened to them. Darrow finally, after 15 years, got access to the sealed records. He sat in the archive room for a very long time. He laughed for quite a while, as his colleagues had expected. He then cried a little, which surprised people who knew him, and he later explained that it was simply the accumulation of years of frustration leaving his body all at once, which everyone accepted as reasonable. Quan filed his military assessment of the human defense situation, which was classified at the highest level, and which concluded that there was no viable military strategy for engaging human space that did not end with your fleet being towed, your crew being fed, and a very organized invoice in your future. He recommended, formally and in writing, that the conclave pursue exclusively diplomatic relations. It was, the committee agreed, obvious. Back on the station a few months after the delegation had come and gone, Tay stood in the docking bay on a quiet afternoon and watched the new traffic building on the approach lanes. Diplomatic vessels, research ships, a few curious private craft from civilizations that were still working up the nerve to actually dock. The station had expanded its greeting protocols. There was a small office now, with a welcome sign above the door, in 17 languages, that Yule had painted herself. The music from the residential block was better lately,